Hi, I'm Jeffrey Rickman, and I'm the pastor of the Nowata Methodist Church. We've done some historical segments before that I've been pretty proud of. We're proud members of the community of Nowata, and we want to do what we can to preserve her heritage and her story, and there's probably a lot more coming down the line. If you haven't seen it, I've sat down with Jack Adams and Jim Patton to talk about Nowata in previous decades. Today, I'm glad to be joined again by Jim Patton and then Janice Drake as well, two longtime members of this church. Both of them can speak to the character and ministry of many people who belonged in this community, and so I wanted to make the time for them to sit down and help us to remember. A lot of us didn't know these people. I didn't know these people. I've only been here for 8 years, but I love hearing the stories of those who came before and made this church what it is. Jim and Janice, thank you for joining me today. Are we feeling
You're
okay?
welcome. Doing great, thanks.
Yeah, Jim, you're
Glad
good?
to be here.
Great. Before we get into the names, just want to say a quick word. Our church has recently left the United Methodist Church. This denomination informed the spiritual life of this community for a long time, and we're going to figure out who we are without that denomination, and we might join another. We're looking at that right now, but I know that it's important for us to talk about where we have been, who we have been, to figure out where we want to go in the future. So I just want to thank you both for helping me and our church community to discern this. So, Janice, I know you came with some names of some people that we should discuss. So I want to just defer to you, and I'll ask questions, and Jim will add texture, and when we're tired, we'll stop.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey, and thanks to Bill, too. And Bill has more history than I do here. We came here from Tulsa in the late 70s and started coming to church here. I'd grown up in the Methodist Church, and one smaller than this one, actually. But several people really made a strong first impression upon us. And I would probably start with Lucille Gillespie. That woman just worked and worked and worked. She took care of this church. She did funeral dinners. She cooked for the Rotary. She was busy. She was substitute mail delivery person, rural mail delivery person. And it was just amazing, all of the work. She kept the nursery. It was amazing, all of the work that she did in this church. She also took care of the flower beds out front. And she could usually be seen with one of the butcher knives from the kitchen out on her knees doing the weeds. And several years later, when Bill Brown got started in the kitchen and started cooking, Bill bought some new knives, some new kitchen knives. And a couple of weeks later, he came up here, and there was Lucille with one of his new butcher knives out doing her gardening. But anyway, Lucille was just she was the backbone of the church for a long time in terms of just getting the work done and taking care of the nursery. And I know Jim's son was in her nursery. That was one of my first impressions. I think that Jim kept raising the age on the nursery because Jimmy wanted to stay with Lucille. But in any case, just an incredible person in this town, and it was a pleasure to get to know her.
Anything to add about Lucille?
Yes. Jim, our son, was not ready to go to church and from the nursery. And he made quite a fuss about it. And Lucille intervened and said, "The boy doesn't need to go. He's not ready. I need a helper in the nursery. I need a helper in the kitchen." He was 12 or 14 years old before he got in the sanctuary, because Lucille always scurried over and got him, ushered him in, and Linda and I stayed out of the way.
Yeah. It's good for everyone.
When she died, he cried.
I'm sure. Yeah.
She got to be over 100 years old.
Yes.
On her 100th birthday, the town recognized her and threw a parade in her honor, which was followed by a birthday party at her church.
Yes. I was there.
What a thing.
Yes.
You were there?
Yes.
Okay.
And when you see her coming in her car, the front seat, the back seat, and the trunk had pots and pans, and they were banging and clanging. She was prepared to cook anywhere at any time.
Oh, my goodness.
And for the funeral dinners, we didn't have an ice maker. She would go to the fairground and get a great big, almost a stock pot full of ice.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And carry that down the back steps and into the church. And she was well in her 80s when she was doing that.
Oh, my goodness.
And a big, 5-gallon kind of thing of ice that she'd carry the ice up here for the church dinners. So she was just an amazing personality.
I had in my notes that she also started the public library here.
That may well be.
She started it out of her personal residence and then finally got the funding to get and I think our current library was built by the Harmon Foundation. But I don't know if there was an intermediary building or not. So
I do not know.
She was a very active person.
The Sinclair field office, which is now Rainey's Meat Market, and before that it was Sinclair gave it to the city of Nowata for the library. And that was the library office and building for many years until we built the one with the Harmon.
Okay.
I
didn't know that. Okay.
Time.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Harmon Library was fairly new when we came to town. That and the swimming pool were fairly new.
Yeah.
Delphia Lee was very instrumental in that. She was head of the library board at that time.
Yeah, she stayed with that library board for a long time.
She believed in it.
Yeah.
What was the name?
Delphia Lee,
Lee.
Brian Lee.
Oh,
First
yes,
National
Delphia.
Bank.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. They were Methodists.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, superb, and always here.
Well, okay, so Lucille Gillespie, she's one of the giants whose shoulders we're standing on. Mm-hmm. And then we can come back and share other anecdotes about her as we want. Who else should we talk about?
Do you want to go with one? Do you want me to go ahead with Mr.
Go ahead.
Cridlin? I would bring up Willard Cridlin. He was known to everyone as Crid. And Crid had been the mail deliverer here for years and years and years. He was real active in the choir. He loved music, and he sang bass. His favorite hymn was Holy Art Thou. And he'd usually sing a few bars for you if you weren't careful. And at one time, it was years before we came here, there had been an orchestra, a Coffeyville Nowata orchestra, and he played tuba in the orchestra. But I understood that when he was delivering mail in the winter, at times he would strap on ice skates onto his shoes to skate and deliver the mail.
I've heard that story as well.
I've not seen that much ice in Nowata during the years. Well, I guess a couple of times we've seen that much ice, but not often. But we used to go out to eat with him once in a while, and he had poor eyesight. He would come bounding out of his house, and I'd be afraid he was going to miss a step coming off of his porch. Did you watch Carl Sagan last night?
No, I didn't.
And going on about the latest in the Sagan science things on PBS and the astronomy and anything science. He was just learning. And we would go to Coffeyville.
Oh, that's what he would ask. I thought you were asking us. I thought you were completely changing the topic.
No.
So he was real into Carl Sagan and Cosmos and all that astronomy
He would
stuff.
ask us, and we'd sit there and say, duh. And then he would start reciting Kipling. He loved Rudyard Kipling. He would recite all the way to Coffeyville and back poetry he had learned when he was in the 8th grade. He was just a remarkable man and so alive and vibrant. And he still drove. When he was in his 90s, you'd go by and he would be out under his car putting chains on his car, on his tires, to drive if there was any ice. And he'd be up on his ladder trimming these tall shrubs. And just a remarkable man, wiry guy. And he came up and helped the pastor count the offerings on Monday mornings, every Monday morning. And I know one of the earlier pastors, when we arrived, considered him his counselor. Crid was a counselor for the pastor,
Okay.
and he was just such a dynamo of energy and insight, and it's a pleasure to know him.
Well, I have one here that is not a member of the church, but I want to bring it up and mention it. Eva Lou Hannigan.
Oh,
She was
yes.
the church secretary during the tearing down of the old building, raising the money, the construction, and she handled all the paperwork, all the invoices, and it would have been very difficult without her efforts.
I'm sure
She
it
needs
was.
to be recognized
And
for that.
She was the auditor of the church. She did the auditing for several years after
that.
in
She was a
in
member of the
70s.
church. She joined by profession of faith on November 20th, 1949, under Alfred C. Pace.
I did not know that.
Yep.
I didn't know that either. I just knew that she was the one that the membership and the leadership trusted to do the audit for the church.
And she took meticulous care of the fundraising. The money came in, she put it in the right places, dispersed it as we needed it.
One of the reasons that was such a successful campaign that you ran. So
I think, did she work for DHS?
She did later.
They honored her. The picture I have for her was from a retirement party they threw for her.
I had a phone call one day, and Eva Lou was upset. She said, "I need you to come by. I need to talk to you." So I came by almost immediately, and she said, "I've been offered a job at DHS." She said, "And you know I've got several kids, and Dick's not always very good about working." That's her husband. She said, "Jim, I hate to leave the church." I said, "Eva Lou, you got to take care of your family first." She said, "Well, I've got a lot of remorse about this." I said, "Take the job." She did.
Absolutely.
Yeah, she still has kids who live in the area that
Yes.
remember running around this church and,
Yes.
Yeah.
and shared
Yeah.
stories of growing up in the second building. I guess we're in the third building now, but they were here during the days of the second building. So
I became pretty active in the music program after we started coming to church here, and Mrs. McSpadden she was just like God kind of walking the halls of this church, it seemed to me. But she had been instrumental in the music program here probably since the 30s, maybe before, as a pianist and choir director and organist. She had professional training. She had attended the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music in her youth. She had studied with Fred Waring, and she had worked on her master's degree at the University of Southern California. She taught choir at the schools, and I know, and this was 30 years after she had retired, former students would send donations to the school for contributions in her honor. $500 here or $500 there. We just want to honor Mrs. McSpadden for what she impacted on, how she impacted my life. And she played the organ the Sunday before she died on Saturday. She just didn't miss. And I know there were days that she would tell me that she'd be halfway through a song in service and she'd forget which key she was playing in and have to think about it because she just knew everything. She had played the song so long. She came to Nowata as a young girl, I think about when she was 13 or 14. Her brother was the district judge here, and she'd grown up in Silver Springs, Arkansas, and her parents thought she needed to get to a little bit better town, and so she came to live with her brother, and started teaching piano lessons, and then later started teaching in the schools, and just was much beloved, and just she loved everyone. You went to her house and she would come walking to the door with her arms outstretched, whether she knew you or not, and just take you in, and just a strong, strong, strong lady and a strong leader, strong Christian. And her faith was very, very important to her.
Say the name of the school she went to again. It was a conservatory?
Cincinnati Conservatory.
Was that for, would that be considered high school level, college level?
That would probably be college level.
Okay.
And then Mary Nell follow in a professional way for training.
Mary Dell went to OU
Yeah.
in music. And
Was Mary Nell her daughter?
yes,
Okay.
and Ms. Mack, her primary music was her voice. She had stopped singing by the time I knew her and just played piano and organ.
You're talking about Beulah?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ms. Mack is what you called her?
Everyone called her Mrs. Mack.
Mrs. Mack. I
Mrs.
hadn't heard
Mack
that.
or Nana.
And
You
whenever Mary Nell called and there was a need or something was going to be performed at church, Mary Nell would call Mother Thanks, and the game was over. Whatever Mrs. Mack wanted, needed,
Yep,
Linda said, okay.
do it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well,
Mother
she
thanks.
was right. Yeah. Well, they worked well together. When Mary Nell took over choir director for her mother, they worked together. They sat down every Tuesday night and planned out the music and practiced it. Mary Nell depended upon her mother. She took care of her mother, but she depended upon her a lot. Mary Nell was as insecure as her mother was secure and confident, but a more loving person you could not find than Beulah McSpadden, in my opinion.
And she had something good to say about everyone. One time Mrs. Mack and Linda and I were having a discussion and about Oral Roberts, and he'd been in the news and everything, and Mrs. McSpadden said to Linda, honey, he's a good man, he has a good heart, but he is just deluded.
Yeah, and she was on his mailing list, and she would show me. I took some piano lessons for a short while, and we visited a lot, got to be very, very close with her. But she would show me her latest mailing from Oral Roberts, and it might be a piece of cloth that said prayer cloth, and the letter would say, place this cloth up on your elbow, and it will make it feel better. But
So was she into that, or was she?
no, she was.
She was just.
She was a staunch believer. She would listen to him, but she didn't fall for the sales pitches.
Man is deluded.
But she was on his mailing list. That's
Oh, of
interesting.
course.
Well, but it didn't take much to be on his mailing list. And when we're off camera, I can tell you some more about that,
Okay.
because
All right.
I was the IBM salesman for their letter writing campaign.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So
All right. TJ, remind me to ask her about it when the cameras are off.
everyone that they could get an address for, they were on their mailing list. If you ever sent them $1, you stay on their mailing list.
Forever.
Impressive.
And then we probably should just go on to Mary Nell.
Sure.
And Mary Nell had this crystal pure voice, soprano. And I know early on when we were going here, we came to the Easter sunrise service, and the Presbyterian Church, the First Christian Church, and the Methodist Church always went together on that. And the service was held at the Methodist Church, and Mary Nell sang The Holy City. And if you did nothing else for the year, for your religious practice, in my opinion, if you heard Mary Nell sing the Holy City, you were filled with the Spirit. It was just this pure crystal voice, perfect pitch, and just did it beautifully. Her mother had sung it for years and years, but after she was widowed, she stopped singing. And when she stopped, she says, if you don't keep practicing and keep working the instrument, you lose it. And so she would never sing after that. But Mary Nell was singing, and just glorious, glorious. And Mary Nell directed the choir, passed when she was able to. She was having dementia, and the whole choir was kind of helping out, trying to help with things, and it got more and more difficult, and finally encouraged her to retire. And I was asked to get in the middle of that because I was very close with Mary Nell. And the pastor did not want to, well, it's kind of hard to fire a volunteer.
Oh, sure.
But he did not want to talk with her, and she was petrified of him, and for no reason. But he was a person of greater substance than she. And so he asked me, and he says, Janice, would you try to talk to Mary Nell? So I knew she was wanting to go visit her sister-in-law. And so I took her to lunch, and I said, Mary Nell, why don't we get you set up to go to Dallas to visit your sister-in-law? And she says, well, I can't. She says, I've got to find someone to replace me. And I said, Mary Nell, that's not your job. You don't have to find someone to replace you for you to retire. And so she finally agreed. And I said, well, why don't we go tell Alan? No, I won't tell him. And I said, well, is it okay if I tell him for you? And so we did it that way. And so I told him, and I helped her get her plane stuff ready to go see her sister-in-law and call the sister-in-law, and we had it all set. And Mary Jeanette was her guardian at the time. I did not tell Mary Jeanette, which is a big mistake. So here I've got Mary Nell all set up, going to a friend in Bartlesville is going to get her to the limo service to the airport, and her sister-in-law is going to meet her at the airport in Dallas. And Mary Jeanette didn't know about it. And so I heard about that for some time, but it worked. It worked. And then we finally got someone else to take over the choir. But
So you didn't collaborate correctly with Mary Jeanette.
I did not collaborate.
Okay.
And Mary Jeanette had...
Pointed that out.
We're talking about Mary Jeanette Wigger.
Yes.
Who
Yes.
was very plain spoken.
Yes.
Okay.
And we were really close friends, but she was Mary Nell's guardian. By that time, Mary Nell was pretty far into dementia.
Yeah.
And she had only put me in charge of material things, not in charge of travel things and retiring things.
So let me ask this question just about, so it would be seen as odd or strange now if there were an older person in the church that wasn't managing perfectly and different people in the church stepped up to help them manage their lives in this way. But was that more common back then, or do you think that this was just an exceptional thing about this church?
I think that was a bit exceptional about that particular family situation. And the two Marys, Mary Nell and Mary Jeanette, had been best friends since they were 5 years old and were just inseparable, both tiny, short people and live wires and talented, and very close families. And Mary Jeanette was just, she was unbelievable in taking care of Mary. She took care of all of her medical needs and saw to everything.
Oh, they were very close bonds.
Yeah, it was
Right.
exceedingly close, and Mary Nell did not have kids, and she had nieces and nephews, but they did not always see just eye to eye, and some of them didn't have quite the patience with Mary Nell that Mary Jeanette did, or that those closest with their day, they didn't live here in town. So those that day-to-day were with Mary Nell. So,
That's quite a thing.
but Mary Nell was just such a talent and such musical leadership that those two gave was just incredible. A magnificent music program, I thought, and substantial Christmas and Easter cantatas every year, and tons and tons of planning and work. And it was because of those two.
Mary Nell and her mother. We've covered some good ground. I know that you had said you wanted to talk about Floy and Charles Schaefer. Floy, of course, I know her name because she was the church historian for many years, and she left a lot of great records about different stages in the life of this church. I don't know quite as much about Charles. I don't even have a picture. I don't have a picture of either of them. Well, I saw one that was not of good quality whenever they were later in life. So if anybody watches this and you have pictures of the Schaefers, please send them to the church. I would love that. What else is to say about Floy and Charles?
Well, they were still alive in here when we arrived, up in years, and Mrs. Schaefer was in fairly poor health. But the reverence that people had for the Schaefers was a testimony to the lives they had lived and the importance they had to this community. I don't know, Brian Lee told me that when Brian's father had the bank and Mr. Schaefer was a significant officer in the bank, and when Brian took over, his dad said, now Brian said, Charlie Schaefer is to always have a desk in this bank. And Brian upheld that. Mr. Schaefer had been retired probably for 10 or 20 years at the point that we knew them. And Brian Lee kept him an office and a desk in that bank. And that was not done away with until Mr. Schaefer passed. And I just know that the man was, to have that dedication and loyalty was just incredibly significant and incredibly a leader and staunch and responsible.
Both of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything to add, Jim?
No.
Okay.
But every bit of that is absolute.
Well, how about we let Janice catch a breath and you tell us about someone else that's important to know about.
I have one lady, Frances Wallace. Frances, you never knew which family with children Frances was going to have those kids in church on Sunday morning. Sometimes they were from families that had a hard life. The kids would be poorly clothed and needed haircuts and what. And it wasn't long until Frances had them with Sunday clothes and had haircuts. And sometimes Frances would get some criticism from some of our membership, what we don't need or want. And Frances would tell them that that's what we're here for. And when she died, the money came in memorials like I'd never seen before. Because people didn't know.
She was the first funeral I did here.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
She was church secretary for many years.
She passed on June 28th, 2015, and I moved here just a couple days later.
Really?
Yeah. But by all accounts, she was a lovely woman.
Lovely,
my.
lovely, yeah.
Yes.
Gracious and pleasant and always here, real dependable. Yes.
She brought those kids.
Was she a DHS worker?
Pardon?
Did she work for DHS? How did she know these kids?
I don't know, but she found them.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I don't know.
She was a
She'd go
docent
pick them up.
She was a docent at the Historical Society Museum, and she worked at Prim's Bakery. Then she was the secretary for T.H. Rogers Lumber, And then she was a secretary for our church.
Yep.
She retired in 2001.
Okay.
Okay. Yep, that's a picture of her counting the money or
Yes,
doing
yeah.
something in the church office.
Yes.
I got the greatest respect for her because
Yeah,
she
yeah.
took those kids, those children, never been to church or very little. And she'd go pick them up, check on them, take them home.
What a lady. Well, give us another one. He's got a whole list of like 50 names here. We're not going to have time for all these. We can do this again, though, if we want to. So, who else?
I didn't know the Mersanis that well, but they were very unique.
Oh, and incredible, faithful
Yes.
people.
lived in
Amerigo and
Amerigo.
Helen.
Helen.
yeah.
Yes.
And lived in Rogers County, drove in,
Lived at Talala.
yeah, quite a distance. And
It was her gift that made this library possible.
well,
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
And then also they renovated the bathrooms on the other side of the building thanks to her.
That would surprise me not. And their sons I know gave generously as memorials. Amerigo had been a pipeline welder for all of his life, and I believe he worked on the North Slope pipeline some. But they had, well, I knew I've met three of their sons, and Paul, the younger one, he moved back in with them in later years and sang in the choir. He had a wonderful and wonderfully trained voice.
I did his funeral as well.
Helen was just so spiritually focused, and I've been told she taught Sunday school here. She was not teaching when I was here, but she was a strong leader in the Disciples Women, and she was very, very focused on the World Council of Churches. She was very devoted to ecumenical work in the World Council of Churches. She did not like having a flag in the church, and someone donated a flagpole and a flag for the outside of the church. And we had quite a discussion. We wound up with that flagpole being erected and that flag being flown, but it was not because Helen agreed with it. But she was just a prayer warrior and magnificent Christian leader.
I didn't meet the third son, but Paul and the older one I met several times.
Frank and Tim.
Frank.
And
When they came, they were in church on Sunday morning with their parents.
yeah, absolutely.
And Frank had multiple car dealerships in the state of Florida. And he also served a term as president of the United States Chamber of Commerce.
Yes.
Yeah. He was a consult to 3 presidents, if I can
Yes.
recall.
Yeah.
Yes.
He wrote an autobiography about his life that I bought and read whenever I.
Okay.
So yeah,
I've not read his autobiography, but I had contacted his foundation for the Boys and Girls Club building, and in doing the research online, his foundation had recently donated $40 million to build a hospital in Florida.
Oh wow.
But he was giving his money away. He and his wife were giving his money away, and I know that they honored the parents here, and I met him on the golf course. Paul, when brothers were in town, Paul would bring the brothers to the golf course. So I met Tim and Frank on the first tee at the golf course. Was my discussion with them, but I was in choir with Paul and just a good steady guy and a beautiful voice.
Mrs. Mersani was, one of her projects she wanted to do was to create better relationships between the different churches here in town, primarily the First Methodist and the First Baptist Church in the black community.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And
Just a couple blocks over there. Yeah.
she put a program together, and where the ministers would visit and come in and do a sermon. It worked well, but the attendance didn't support it. We didn't have enough Methodists to go over there, and the Baptists coming here, so it didn't ever get off the ground very good.
Yeah.
But
I knew that they attended at the black church for a while, but I did not.
yeah, she wanted to make them closer
Wow,
together,
yeah.
the two churches, and there was no hostility. There was no one against it, but people just didn't participate.
Yeah, it was more difficult then. Yeah.
They stayed at home at their own churches.
Well, it's even difficult today. I like the pastor over there, and I'm friends with some of the people, but efforts to try and get together really haven't.
Well,
Even nowadays.
They didn't many years ago either.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not that they're hostile. It's just
No.
there's not a lot of excitement about
No,
it. So
no.
it's an interesting thing where we want to be close together, but that doesn't result in us being close together.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Janice, let's go back to you.
Okay, I would probably just go back and revisit a few of the Sunday school teachers. We've talked about some of them already. Bill Tomlinson, who was a high school principal, taught a senior adult Sunday school class, and he must have had 20 and 30 people in there.
He was a high school principal, you said?
Yes.
He came here.
He had been a basketball coach prior to being the principal here. He was just a marvelous, marvelous human being. And because I've been in the choir, it kind of overlapped with Sunday school, but I attended a few of these classes.
He taught which
And
class you said?
It was a senior adult, so it was probably 30s to the 70s, and he would have 20 and 30 people in that room. Magnificent Sunday school teacher. They had magnificent sharing amongst the group. But when he would start in talking about Paul, you felt like you were just sitting right there with Paul.
When Bill Tomlinson was hired and came here, the school system was in complete disarray. We had issues with athletics, basketball team, and queen coronations and that sort of thing. And Bill came in and just calmed the waters. He took a young teacher and said, "Linda, we need a speech program." She said, "I don't know anything about that." He said, "Yes, you do. You're teaching speech." He said, "Just humor me and let's talk about it and start it." Well, went from there to, excuse me, a national championship and a state trophy.
He saw it in her. You're talking about your wife,
Yeah.
of course.
That's right.
Yeah.
Sure. Magnificent man. And still after retiring, she was in demand as a speaker, motivational speaker, and that lady's got more energy in her little finger than I've ever had in my body in my whole life. But it's amazing.
That all
impact
came
on
from
the
Bill
students.
Tomlinson.
And how long did he teach Sunday school here?
Well, I don't know how long he had been teaching, mid-70s. I'm not sure when he came here. I would guess it was late 60s or early 70s.
It was early 70s. We
Early
had
70s
the
when he
basketball
came here.
program was in
that
disarray.
was in
The
the
town was
70s.
totally split,
Yeah,
and it was not good.
yeah, because my hometown team played against his basketball teams all the time I was in high school, and we never beat his teams. He was just a good man, and it turns out that he and my basketball coach were best friends and fishing buddies, and both taught Methodist Sunday school classes. But I got to know him here. I mean, I'd known who he was the whole time I was in high school because he was the opposing coach. But
Do you know if he taught Sunday school the whole time he lived here? Like, would he have started in the 70s?
They came in the 70s. I do not know when he started teaching Sunday school here,
Okay.
but by 78 he was teaching Sunday school and had a magnificent class.
Okay. I'll see if I can't find a picture of him. I don't have one. All right, who wants to
Okay,
give us another person?
Some other teachers. Bob Nunnally taught, who was a high school teacher. He taught the high school students class for probably about 20 years.
I want to mention Kay Cody,
Okay.
young girls. She taught girls' class at Sunday school. It was very important to Kay. Kay was never married, never had children, but she took these young girls Sunday morning and had their attention in the palm of her hand.
She used to teach what class here?
Young girls.
I'm not sure I knew that about Kay, and I know Kay.
Yeah.
And then Bob, he did youth age Sunday school class.
High school students, yeah, boys and girls. And he was a fine teacher and dedicated teacher. And then Bill Maddox was teaching adult class when I was
Yes.
here. And I expect he might have taught in the earlier years too, but he was a good Sunday school teacher.
Bill Maddox.
Yes.
He was still teaching when I got here.
Yeah. And then in the youth program, Jerry Krieger, she was our lay leader,
Oh yeah.
and she was a high school teacher and devoted to the church, and a good lay leader. And she usually was a substitute.
It was Criger, right?
Criger.
And she's now married to a
She's
Methodist
now
minister.
married.
Yeah.
It's Williams now, Jerry Krieger Williams. She taught high school English here for several years. I don't know,
She
maybe
grew up in Grove,
20 years.
attended
something like
ORU.
She was also tied to the Claremore Church when I was growing up there. She was a familiar face, so for some reason I can't find my file on her. But yeah, we have a lot of pictures of her helping lead worship here. And
that. She was excellent. She could deliver a mighty fine sermon, and just so devoted to Christ. A superb individual, and still is. I'm sure she's been a superb pastor's wife. They're retired and doing a lot of grandkid things now, but she was a key cog in the wheel for several years in the 70s and 80s, like in the 1980s, I would say.
yeah,
Becky Whitford helped with the youth program, as did Pat Muir and Sarah Collier. And they were all school teachers that were willing to also help with their church, the students at the church. I know once I asked Sarah to stand up and speak. We were trying to raise money to buy a new organ because ours had bit the dust. And she agreed to, and then she got nervous, and she says, Janice, she says, I'm used to talking to little people. And I says, well, I tell you what, when you stand up, you just tell people just to slink down on their knees and play like they're little people. And she did great. Sarah was she's a fine individual.
I have another lady that not so much from church, but what she did at her work. Margaret Fisher
Oh, absolutely.
was junior high secretary, and Chester Price happened to be principal at that time. But Margaret took kids from needy families, bought them clothes, found them clothes, gave them lunch money, bailed them out trying to get their lockers unlocked. Margaret serving those kids in junior high is just amazing.
She was that kind of woman.
She was.
Warm and caring and gracious and always a smile.
and she was a member of this church.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
For years.
Yeah.
She was
Bill too, but
She was the administrative board secretary for years and years.
I'm not sure I knew that.
and Bill Fisher, her husband, Bill and our son Jim, from a 5 or 6 years old, they harvested the Christmas tree and brought it in every year.
Really?
They had a lock on
On that, yeah, okay, good.
Yeah, that's one of those vital roles that you don't realize it's not getting filled till it's not getting filled, or who's doing it. Yeah, that's pretty important.
Actually, the first time, Bill had already made arrangements with Jim that they were going to do it, and then Bill said, "I need you to come along. Just be sure that everything okay." Well, that was the first and last. After that, they didn't need me.
Yeah, there was a Bill Fisher Sr. and then a Junior.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
That's correct.
And then Junior passed in 2020.
Yes.
And then Senior,
Senior passed in the 90s,
92.
yeah.
Yeah.
When we had Herb Colvin's funeral, the family was all scattered out, Washington, state of Washington. There wasn't very many of them. And it was bitterly cold that day. And Bill Fisher and I were there, and he had a heavy coat, and I did too. Looked around, there was just a very small number. And Bill said to me, he said, "Jim, my pickup's outside. I've started heaters on. We're going to the cemetery because the only people it's going to be is four or five family members and the preacher." And I said, "Bill, you know how cold it is out there?" He said, "I do. Get in the pickup." We went out. Sure enough,
Yeah.
it was the preacher, Bill Fisher, myself, and 3 or 4 family members.
Well, bless you for going.
Bill did the right things too.
Yeah.
He was just behind the scenes.
Now, I know that Bill Brown was real significant in the construction of working with, he was Jim's partner in crime with the construction of this church building. And Bill became active again in the early 90s and kind of got involved in kitchen thing and started the
Dinners with Love.
the Dinners with Love on Wednesday night and fed, I don't know, 50, 100 people. And Bill became quite a cook, quite a chef, and helped upgrade the kitchen to be able to provide for it. But he was a dynamo, and when we did the organ, got the new organ, we needed some better lighting. The people wanted more lighting, and we needed a better sound system. And we had a couple of gentlemen. We didn't know how we were going to raise the money for a new organ, and I was put in charge of the fundraising for that. And luckily, we had two gentlemen in the choir. And as soon as we knew we were going to do that, one of them stood up and said, Anson paged him, says, "Clarence says, I'll give $1,000 if you'll give $1,000. And Clarence says, "I'll do it." And so the following Sunday, we got them to stand up in church, and they challenged the rest of the congregation. And pretty soon we had the $19,000 we needed for the organ, and then some. And it was about that time that Mr. Cridlin passed, and I checked with his daughter, because there was going to be quite a bit of memorial money coming in for him, about doing the sound system, and because he loved the music so much, so she certainly agreed to that. And we got enough of the sound system, and we just kept pushing and pushing, and finally had enough of the lighting system. And I think by the end of it, that there was close to $50,000 given. But I would credit Anson and Clarence mostly with that, because they stood up and said, "I'll give $1,000 if you'll give $1,000." And they kind of looked out at the congregation and got people looking at one another. And we had a lot of people that played bridge at that time. I was not one of them. I've never learned to play bridge. But we knew if we got one person at each bridge table to say they'd give $1,000, that we had $4,000. So that was a big part of it. But the church just really gave generously, and we were able to do lighting and sound and organ all at the same time. So
I did not have Anson Page on my list, but I had his nickname, Old Shep. The old shepherd. And every Christmas he would prepare a cheese ball, large and round, with an awful lot of chili powder on the outside of
oh wow,
We're talking about Anson Page.
it. Yes, and Mrs. Page played the organ.
yes.
That was
After
her.
Mrs. McSpadden died,
Yes, that's the
Catherine,
connection there.
Catherine played the organ.
That's the connection there. And
That's him as part of a color guard. I don't know which one he is, but his name was
He was
listed
tall,
on
tall and very handsome.
he's the
Probably
Page
right.
family.
there. He's the rightmost one, yeah.
Yeah, Page Bottling Company, here at the turn of the century.
Wait, he owned a company?
No, his family did. He
Okay.
had a bottling company, made soda pop. We have the old B&B Freight Building up here on the corner of Elm and Choctaw. And that's also the location of the first Page bottling plant there. It had a house, and the bottling plant was on the back side of it by the railroad track. Then later, they built a brand new, modern, up-to-date Page bottling plant down on South Maple. They closed that street a few years ago, railroad, but it's a vacant lot now. It's got a tower there on that corner, but that's where the Page Bottling Company was built in probably somewhere late 20s, early 30s, and that's Anson's family.
Okay.
Okay.
The story I'd heard on him was that he used to have a big plant on the west side of his house that he was really proud of, and he'd trim it up every year. And he always complained about kids coming by and messing with it. And then finally the sheriff had to get involved because it turned out it was a marijuana plant and it needed to go. But he didn't know that, of course.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about that.
I didn't know that story. But Catherine was an artist, and she just jumped in. She did play, and she worked awfully hard to pick up the organ duties. She practiced and practiced and practiced, and just put a ton of effort to provide the organ music for us for several years.
She was apparently tied to the 1033 ambulance service here in town in some way.
They both probably were.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's about as much as we can do today. I want to thank both of you for coming in. I see that both of you have many more names that we can cover. So if you've enjoyed this, please share this with somebody and then write your comments, or you can call the church and leave a message. We want to complete this history. If you have pictures of the people or additional anecdotes about the people, we want to honor their legacy here. We have a big member book. I'll have it here. I should have had it right on the table, but it's that thick, wouldn't you say, just full of the records on these people. I think I'm going to see if I can't cajole y'all into coming in again sometime, whenever's good for you. But let's talk more of these names sometime soon. And so if you are a person who's been touched by any of the lives lived here, and you would like to offer a memorial gift in their honor, you can always send that to the church. And typically what we do is we put it in our endowment fund so that it benefits the church in perpetuity in their memory. So we don't blow it on anything where then their legacy is gone. So that's always welcome. And then we just appreciate your prayers for the church as we try and carry forward the legacy of these people forward. Thanks for joining us. We'll hope to see you again when we do another one of these.
Thanks.
All right.